Hello, everybody. This is Bennett Tchaikovsky. Welcome. Today, we're going to be going over some different overhead allocations, and we're going to be looking today at activity-based costing. So my disclaimer and copyright notice is that the opinions in this presentation are those of myself and not my employers or any other affiliated organizations, including but not limited to Irvine Valley College and the South Orange County Community College District. The contents of this presentation do not constitute any legal or accounting advice whatsoever and are for educational purposes only. This presentation is copyright 2024 by Bennett Tchaikovsky. All rights are reserved. Any distribution without my prior written consent is strictly prohibited. So let's go ahead and take a look at our activity-based costing question. So I just went through and we basically went through and did this very question. So you probably want to, if you're approaching this for the first time, you probably want to watch this video first. I'll provide the link below. But as we're going through and looking at these questions, we've got over here, YYZ produces two models of electric bicycles. One sells for 4,000 while the other sells for 5,000. We had direct materials, direct labor. So when I'm giving an exam that's covering this particular chapter, I'm going to give a certain data set, and I'm going to ask my student to go through and to basically compute things using basically one will be single plant wide, the other one will be using activity-based costing. Now, when it comes to this question, right, the sales price over here under both single plant wide and activity-based costing, as we'll go through over here and see, is that the sales price over here of 4,000 per unit, 5,000 per unit, right? It tells us 4,000 was for the 80. The other one is for 5,000. And then the direct materials and direct labor were 2,800. And then over here, this is going to be at 4,600. So these are exactly the same as single plant wide. The only difference between what we're going to be going through and looking at has to deal with the basically the factory overhead, how we're going through and computing it. For single plant wide, I took the 3.8 million, divided it by the driver, which in that case was over here the number of tests, to come up with my rate per unit. I then went through, basically got an allocation so I got my rate per test, basically took the number of tests, the overhead per test, the rate per test, and then I got to my allocation. Once I had the allocation, I divided this by units produced to come up with the per unit, which is what I needed over here. For activity-based costing, what basically makes this question a little bit different is that when we're going through here is instead of taking this 3.8 million, instead is what we're going to be going through and doing is we're going to be looking at costs. We're going to basically be looking at these on an individual basis. We're going to be taking the total cost over here. We're going to be dividing it by the driver. Okay. When I take the cost and divide it by the driver, I'm going to get a rate per driver. Okay, so I'm going to be going through and coming up with a rate per driver. Let's go through and do a few of these. So over here for setups, 300,000, right? So we're not taking the total overhead and dividing it by one factor. We're looking at it now more granular. We're looking at each one individually. So this is going to be 300,000 divided by 200. 1.8 million divided by 50,000. This over here is going to be 20,000 divided by 100. This over here is going to be 1.4 million divided by 700, or 2,000. This is going to be 80,000 divided by 50. And this over here is going to be 200,000 divided by 5,000. Okay, so that's how we went through and computed these. What I now need to go through and do is my goal is, it's kind of the same as it was over here. Here I took this 3.8 million and I allocated this between the 80 and the 100 kph. But over here, I now need to do this a little bit more granularly, on a more granular basis, and basically figure out, okay, how much am I going through and allocating to the 80? How much am I going through and allocating to the 100? So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this over here DD. I'm going to take my rate per driver and multiply it by basically the drivers used by the product. Okay, so my rate per driver times the driver use. This is going to be my allocation. So I'm going to take 30 times 1,500. I'm going to take 40,000 times 36. I'm going to take 10 times 200. I'm going to take 600 times 2,000. Over here, I'm going to take 5 times 1,600. And then over here, I'm going to take 40 times 4,000. When I go through and add all of these up, this is going to give me the total amount I'm going to be allocating to 80 kph. Let's go ahead and look at the other one over here. And I'm going to call this use of drivers, call that FF. When I take basically the rate per driver, I multiply that by the use of the driver, I'm going to get my allocation. So here I'm going to take 170 and multiply it by 1,500. Here I'm going to take 10,000 and multiply it by 36. Here I'm going to take 90, multiply that by 200. Here I'm going to take 2,000, multiply it by 100. And here I'm going to take 1,600 and multiply that by 45. And then I'll take 40 times 1,000. And there we go. I add these up, and this will go through and tell me how much I'm allocating to the 100 kph. Notice here, the total amount of the overhead being allocated has to equal to 3.8 million. If it doesn't allocate, add up the ones I did over here. 300,000 allocated 45,000 and then 255. 1.8 million, 1,440,000 went to the 80. 360 went to the 100 kph. 2,000 for this one plus 18. 1.2 plus 200,000, that equals the 1.4 million. Over here, 8,000 plus 72 is 80. 60 plus 40 is 200. So coming over here and looking at this, this is the allocation for the 80 kph. Total allocation for the 100 kph. Now, do I take these amounts and put these up over here? Do I show this as 2,855,000? And do I show this over here as 945? The answer is no. Why not? This is a per unit, right? This is just the total amount of the overhead that's being allocated. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to take the total amount of the allocation and I need to divide this by my units produced. Okay. My units produced over here were 4,000 for the 80 kph. Where did I get that information from? It's over here. It's going to be in the problem, right? I basically, it's 4,000 units of 80,000 units of 100. So coming over here, this is going to be 713.75. So my allocation for factory overhead over here, 713.75. My allocation over here, so my total allocation for the 100 kph is 945,000. I produced 1,000 of these units. How do I know I produced 1,000? It's in the problem, right? Coming right up over here. Basically, you got 1,000 units of 100 kph are going through and being produced. So my rate per unit for the 100 kph is 945. So if I put 945 up here, okay. So now my total costs per unit are now 3,514 for the 80 kph, and it's 5,545 for the 100 kph. So my profit on the 80 is about 486, while my profit on my loss per unit is about 545. If I look at this over here, right, and this is why it's so important for us to be thorough about looking at how we do things. This over here this is obviously what we just went through and did. This is activity-based costing. And when we go through and do activity-based costing, it's much more granular, but it's also really reflecting to us as like, hey, if we just went on a single plant wide, we could be making a very wrong decision because this number is going to be way more accurate. So when we look at this, this is how we go through and compute the activity-based costing, gross profit or loss. But let's now go through and take a look at problem 6. Based on our results for single plant-wide and activity-based costing, what would we advise the manager of YYZ to do? Okay, so a few things. So the one thing that stands out, the one thing that we have to be the most concerned about is that the 100 kph, no matter which method we're using, is operating at a loss. Okay, so based on our results, the first thing is, well, both methods, the 100 kph is being sold at a loss. Okay. Under single plant wide, the loss was 3,020 per unit. While while under ABC, the loss was 545 per unit. Right? So if something's being sold at a loss, what would I advise them to do? Well, you really have two choices. We can either cut costs, right? Which may or may not be possible, or we can raise prices. So it's like today going to Jersey Mike's and finding out that a regular sandwich costs 12 bucks. Well, why not? So coming over here, therefore YYZ may want to consider either reducing costs for the 100 kph unit or raising prices for the 100 kph unit. Okay. Now, the other thing I would also say, right? So this is definitely one thing we can go through and say, and by using the dollar amounts, we're quantifying our answer. I would also say that ABC, using ABC gives much more accurate results. Okay. And because we are looking at overhead on a more detailed basis. Okay. And, I think that in this case, and because the allocations are so different, we may want to use activity-based costing. Now, the one thing is, though, is that had we gone back over here, and if we said, okay, instead of using on based on tests, if we would have gone through over here and said, okay, let's go ahead and do this based on machine hours, right? And if we had over here 40,000 machine hours for the 50, so I mean for the 80 kph, and then for the 100, if I look at it this way, right? If I compare using this allocation right over here of 3,040,000 to 760, believe it or not, right? We got over here using ABC, we got 2,855,000, and over here we had 940, basically 2,000,000, we had 945,000. If we went through and used, instead of using, we would actually get results that are somewhat close to activity-based costing. So what we may want to kind of go through and say is that, well, YYZ may want to consider using, may want to basically want to make a different driver than tests for determining single plant wide. Okay, now this kind of gets us down to this answer over here. Why would we go through, if instead of using tests, what we would go through and do? So this is basically what I mentioned in the other video. And if you watch it towards the end, you'll hear me talk about this. But what we could also now say that the allocation of machine hours is closer to the machine hours using single plant wide is closer to the activity-based costing allocation. Therefore, using machine hours may be better to use. Okay, so when you go through, and obviously I did not quantify this, but if we were to go through and to quantify it, we would say 3,040,000. Mm. 2,855,000 and then 945. Okay, so That's how we would go through and talk about this. Now, if you're taking my class, I'm pretty sure that I made this your extra credit question for an upcoming exam. Just make sure you kind of pay attention to the announcements. But if you're taking this class in spring of 2024, this would basically be an extra credit type of question. But that's how you would go through and discuss it. Remember, as we're going through and talking about this, we always want to use numbers to quantify just because it makes our lives a lot easier moving forward. So I want to thank you today for joining me on this activity-based costing journey. I look forward to seeing you on future videos, and feel free to leave comments below if you'd like to see any other content. And I look forward to seeing you on future videos. Have a great day.